Prelude 2. This is the beginning of Unit 2. We're going to be going into the Middle Ages and Renaissance in this unit. You can see a very large span of time. We've got from 476, which is the fall of the Roman Empire, all the way through 1600, or just a little bit after 1600. So that's a large span of time. We're not going to cover it very in depth. It's going to be a big overview. Obviously, in over 1,000 years, music did go through a lot of transitions, but really the bulk of what we know about music and any music that you may have heard that might fall into what we call the classical is going to occur after 1600, most likely 18th and 19th century, you may be a little more familiar with. So this you most likely will not be familiar with much of. One of the things that music kind of grew out of was the church. And music was used in order to enhance worship services. Um, you're going to see a lot of material throughout this book that has to do with the European musical tradition, really defined the development of Western music. Notation is very important, musical notation. When music first existed, which I think anybody could say that's existed as long as people have existed, because you can make music with just about anything. But we wouldn't necessarily have record of it because we wouldn't be able to see it written down unless they notated it. And that was a whole language that needed to be developed. It developed throughout the European continent, and so that European musical style really is what we're going to see carrying down. We'll see a lot of the influence of that in both language and religion, and it's all connected to the church because the purpose of music at that point, at least the written down music, was to enhance worship. That is why they thought it was important and important enough to write down. So it was preserved, it was taught, it was learned, it was bought, and it was sold. It was very much a commodity or a product. A lot of the music was for spiritual purposes. That would be called sacred music. We're going to take a look at early worship music and see how worship music and music traditions changed as society changed. And then later we'll look at secular music, which secular would be referring to more of the entertaining or social aspect of music, more personal expression of music. All right, so ancient Mediterranean cultures, that's where we're going to start. The fall of the Roman Empire was 476. Okay, that's the beginning of the Middle Ages. So we're looking at about 500 years in the early Middle Ages, and kings were very important, as well as the Roman Catholic Church. There was a famous king named Charlemagne who was a very progressive monarch, and he made great strides in furthering education, in creating a very strong centralized government, and in developing musical notation. Remember, the way to write down music is a very distinct way, but it had to be developed. It was not something that could just be learned just because you know how to write. To be able to indicate music, the notes, the rhythms, things like that, it took a development of a whole new way of notation and communicating. The second half of the Middle Ages, the later Middle Ages, we're going to see emergences of cities, of universities, more cultural centers throughout Europe. Particularly, these cathedrals became kind of musical centers and schools of thought. We'll look at Notre Dame in Paris, which I don't know if you remember a few years back, but that one caught on fire. Very, very sad. So that went through a lot of damage not too long ago. So we're going to take a look at some of the early composers in this Western tradition, Leonine and Palatine, and something called organum. This is a bust of Charlemagne. Well, obviously a replica of it. And then we're going to talk about how trade influenced music. This is going to be a little bit more on the social aspect, secular music, music in the vernacular. Merchants were a certain class that arose out of the feudal society. And if you don't know much about the Middle Ages, um, feudal societies were kind of the way the societies were organized. Music was very much a necessity for them to escape the hardship of life and to provide some recreational activity. It's very important to their lives. And so we're going to see how music developed in the vernacular as well. We're not going to talk much about the Crusades, but the Middle Ages, the Crusades were a big deal. Um, that was Crusades for the church, but that did have an effect in the status of women. The age of chivalry came as a result of those Crusades, and so we are going to see some music that kind of emerges from that age of chivalry as well. There are songs called well, they're from court minstrels, troubadours, and trouvères is what we're going to talk about. And they were all about adoring women. A faithful knight worshiping his lady from afar. And so a lot of these were French poets turned musicians, and they would write the music and also play a little accompaniment. And we will see some extensive notation tradition of love songs that came out of this age of chivalry, also looking at a few different instruments that were very Middle Eastern sounding, that kind of were borrowed from and adapted from Middle East. Early Renaissance is from 1450 to 1520, and we're going to look at the Renaissance, and a lot of things are happening in the Renaissance. Invention of printing, a lot of discoveries of new lands, the Gutenberg press you may have heard of, the fall of Constantinople. So you're going to see a lot of history kind of intertwining here. We won't look too much at it, but it is important to kind of see where history matches because it affects the development of music. And Greek and Roman culture were renowned and wanting to be revisited around that time. And so there was a lot of interest in Greek and Roman styles of art, painting, sculpture, even design of buildings, architecture, and for sure we're going to see that influence in music as well. All right, so there were only a few places that musicians could actually get work or be supported from. That would be the church. We talked about that being a very important place. They could be hired by the city or state, like working for a king, or working for an instrument builder, a teacher, working for a printer, or being a printer of music. That didn't come till later. But those were the different types of jobs that a musician or someone that was involved in music could do. And so the institutions would have been church choirs, church schools. That's where the music learning went on, was in church schools. Then you had music publishing houses. You even had some small bands. The bands were much different than we would think of today, but they did occur back then. I'm skipping some of these pictures, but you're welcome to take a look at them. You can see a lot of this medieval art. It's very interesting, a lot different than if you take a look at Renaissance art. And then as you go through the centuries, you'll see how the art really changes. But take a look at that notation there. Just take a look at that. Very interesting to note how music looked. That's early music notation called a neume, which is a little bit different than the notes on the staff today, but the same idea, where you can see the lines going up and you can see them going up and down, indicating the movement of the melody. There also were apprentices that people would hire, and most of these people were going to be men. All right, there were very few professional women. At most, you might have some court singers that were women, but most musicians were men. Towards the end, you're going to see, end of this time period, you're going to see a rise of the merchant class, which was a new group of music patrons. It wasn't just for kings and queens anymore. They had more of a cultivated middle and upper class society. And so these amateur musicians rose up as music became more widely available, books were available, more affordable, and so therefore music literacy spread into more private rather than just the church or just in the king's court. You can see here a picture of a woman who's accompanied by a man playing a lute, which is one of those Middle Eastern um, types of instruments. Early music performance really had a lot to do with just what we guess it would be like because there was no recordings and they did not notate all of the things they did. So um, you're going to have a lot of interpretations, which are going to be a best guess scenario. Modern performances are given a lot of leeway when they try to recreate early music because they're guessing in many ways what it was like. In the sacred genres, a lot of ensemble music was popular, which means you would have choruses, choirs, all male ensembles. Women could not could not sing in church. They were prohibited from singing in church. But with secular music, you're going to see a lot of different varieties, not necessarily big ensembles. You could have voice and instrument, just someone playing an instrument, some more simple varieties as well. Thank you.